Is it possible to understand English without translating into your native language? Another follow-up question was, how can we stop translating when speaking English? So we'll talk about this in this episode today. Is it possible to speak your target language without translating everything into your mother tongue?
I think this is a problem that many English learners have. They want to speak English fluently and quickly, but something is slowing them down, and that is when they're thinking of an idea or thinking of something to say, it's coming first in their native language, and then they have to think, okay, how can I change this to English so that I can speak? But by the time you do that, it's too slow, right? Conversation moves very quickly. And if you are translating in your head first, it puts you at a big disadvantage. I think especially with Korean, right, Jeremy? We know this all too well. Korean and English are very different. If your native language is very different from English, it takes a little while to translate in your head, and this can cause problems. So Jeremy, you and I were chatting before we pressed record about this, and I really liked your perspective on this issue, your take. Could you let our listeners know what you were telling me earlier?
Sure. I think that Donggu is going through a phase, a stage in the language learning process that everyone who learns a second language has to go through. In the beginning of your language learning journey, you have to translate. You have to rely on your native language to understand the new language, of course. And as time goes on, you do that less and less and less. Now, I think the difficult part for most people comes when they get to the point where they can speak the language they're learning. They can have conversations, they can make sentences pretty quickly, but they have to think a lot, and they're constantly checking their grammar in their head and translating from their native language into the language that they're speaking. This is a very frustrating stage to go through because you are able to speak that language and understand that language, but not well enough to be satisfied. So you are always feeling unsatisfied, frustrated, and I'm sure that's why Donggu sent us this letter. Now, as Andrew was saying, for those who don't know, Andrew and I both have been learning Korean for many years now, and we both speak Korean very frequently. And I remember going through this phase where I had to stop relying on translating from English into Korean.
Jeremy, I remember it was almost like a light bulb suddenly went on and something clicked in my head, and I suddenly comprehended and fully understood kind of Korean sentence structure. And once that clicked, everything became clear, and suddenly I didn't have to think in English too much. Of course, my Korean is not fluent yet, but I didn't have to think first in English and then change it to Korean. I could just speak the Korean right away. And I think what got me to that point was tons of listening practice. So tons and tons of just repetitive listening all the time. I would have podcasts going, even if I didn't understand the content, just have podcasts going while I was doing housework or, out and about in the city. So I would say, Donggu's question here is, how can we stop translating? Now, this might be a little bit of a frustrating answer because there's no magic solution, I think. It's just lots of input, right? Listening a lot and also being patient.
Another thing to realize for Donggu or anyone in this phase is that there are already lots of phrases in English that you understand without needing to translate them. Thank you, please, stop, come over here. These very simple sentences, they are very effortlessly understood, and judging from his email, I can tell that Donggu can clearly speak these basic sentences. So those have already become very natural. But the longer sentences and the more difficult structures, those take more time to digest, sort of. With language learning, it's sort of like eating. When I eat a sandwich or some soup, eventually that food becomes my body. My arm is made of the food I've eaten for the last year or so, right? So what you eat becomes your body. And when you listen to language or you have input from the outside, eventually that language will become a part of you. It will become you. And this takes time, especially with Korean and English.
Okay, Jeremy, I do have perhaps 2 hacks that we could offer. I want to bounce these 2 ideas off you to see what you think. So the first suggestion that I have is that, I don't know if we mentioned, but Donggu is working for an engineering company. And so a lot of the conversations are around technical things, right? Technical vocabulary, talking about concrete and construction and asphalt. And so maybe one of the things that is causing some problems here is that Donggu is not getting enough input about this topic. So I would suggest, looking for some engineering YouTube channels based on these topics, based on construction or farming or building, whatever it is specifically that Donggu does. Hearing those conversations over and over will help increase English fluency when talking about these subjects. What do you think about that? Is that a good suggestion?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Even in English, I am not very fluent in these topics that Donggu is working on daily, building bridges and trenches. So, of course, I would be able to communicate very well in that situation, but I don't have practice. Therefore, I lack a lot of vocabulary in these areas. So, I'd say that's a great idea. You could even search for tutorials, so videos where people teach you how to do that thing. Those are very helpful sometimes because the thing they're showing you on the screen is very visual and it helps with comprehension.
In my Korean studies recently, I've been watching YouTube videos about farming and woodworking. These are really interesting topics for me, and it's cool to learn about them in Korean instead of in English. So I would encourage Donggu to do the same thing, just in reverse.
Yeah, it works. Trust us.
And the second thing that I would encourage Donggu to do is develop some muscle memory by doing some repetitive output practice. So what I mean by this is just developing maybe some sentences that you can use in many different situations related to the kind of content that you need to talk about. And then just like you practice a piano scale, you have to sit down and just practice saying them. And you could record yourself saying them as well, so you can listen to yourself and get some feedback that way. But just developing that sharpness, that speed. I think there is a component sometimes where our mouth can just betray us, right? And this will also help, strengthen the speed of your thinking as well. If you have those set phrases, set expressions in your back pocket, and you can just pull them out easily because you've built up the muscle memory at home, then I think this would help eliminate that translation stage.
Yeah, this is perfect. This is basically what actors do. Practice your lines, saying them over and over and over until you get the intonation and pronunciation and speed correct. And then once you get it right, you can go out and practice and rehearse and then perform. So I think your advice is great. I definitely did that a lot, often with interacting with people in coffee shops in Korea or taxi drivers. I remember imagining the situation, and I would run it over in my head. Before I got in the taxi, I would think about it. Okay, how am I going to say this? Okay, I'm going to say it like that. Then I'd open the door and I would say it the way that I practiced. And it worked out pretty well.
Yeah, I've done that actually with some expressions too. And it wasn't until later on, really, that I even fully understood what those expressions mean. At the time, I just kind of had the translation. Okay, you say this to achieve this goal, so I'm going to practice this sentence. And then it was only until, a couple of years later when I started to understand Korean more, I realized what some of these words that I was saying actually meant. So it can be effective, even if you don't know what it means. You can still communicate sometimes.
Yeah, and so if you just keep doing this, Donggu, if you keep doing this, we promise that it will get better. And eventually, you'll realize that you're not translating anymore. Actually, I think this is a good point to end with. Getting better in English, getting better in the language that you're learning, isn't like achieving something. It's not gaining a positive thing. It's more of reducing a negative thing. So the pain slowly goes away. So it doesn't feel like you're doing something great. Like if you're exercising and you lift weights and your muscles get bigger, you see positive feedback. But with language learning, often it is the reduction of pain and difficulty over time, slowly. And that's what the process of getting better is. It doesn't feel fun.
I think of it as like a cloudy day. When you start learning English, everything is cloudy. And then slowly, as the day progresses and you learn more, the clouds roll away and it becomes sunnier and you can see everything more clearly. You can see the scenery, you can see the city, and you're able to understand more. And so I totally agree with you. You don't have that direct feedback that like bodybuilders might have, right? They can just see their arms growing. So that's kind of frustrating. But Donggu, just trust the process. Keep on keeping on, and you'll get there.
And if you do end up recording yourself, you can listen back later on in a month or 2 or 6 months, and you can then notice your improvement. That can be a form of feedback. We promise it will get better.